Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Stephanie Valdez, and I'm the co-owner of the bookstore. Tonight, it is our great privilege to host Marilynne Robinson. She joins us to discuss Jack, which was released just today. If you haven't seen it yet, it's beautiful. She'll be in conversation tonight with Esmé Weijun Wang. While the pandemic has taken a toll on every facet of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become a bright spot in the book world. Thank you to Marilyn, Esmé, and to all of you for your time and attention this evening. And now for some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. We've collected some questions from the audience in advance, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the program. A caveat for tonight's event: we're all at the mercy of our home or internet connections, so please bear with us for any technical issues that might arise. And a brief update about your copy of the book. We just received our copies today. If you selected in-store pickup, your book is ready for you. For everyone else, our store staff will be packing up books and shipping them out over the next few days. We appreciate your patience, especially given postal delays. Let me introduce tonight's presenters and we'll get started. Marilynne Robinson is the recipient of a 2012 National Humanities Medal awarded by President Barack Obama for her grace and intelligence in writing. She is the author of Gilead, winner of the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Home, winner of the Orange Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and Lila, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her first novel, Housekeeping, won the Hemingway Foundation Pen Award. Robinson's nonfiction books include The Givenness of Things, When I Was a Child, I Read Books, Absence of Mind, The Death of Adam, and Mother Country. She lives in Iowa City, Iowa. Esmé Weijun Wang is a novelist and essayist. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling essay collection, The Collected Schizophrenias, for which she won the Gray Wolf Nonfiction Prize. Her debut novel, The Border of Paradise, was called a Best Book of 2016 by NPR, and one of the 2015 novels of 2016 by Electric Literature. She was named by Granta as one of the best of young American novelists in 2017 and won the Whiting Award in 2018. I'll first turn it over to Marilynne Robinson, who will start with a brief reading.
Thank you. Am I visible? Am I there? I'm going to read from a part of this book in which Jack has fallen very much in love with an African-American teacher, a very elegant young woman to whom he is a risk, because it's in St. Louis that they are both living. At that time, like most of the country, a very, very sharply segregated city. And so he's attracted to her in a very deep way at the same time that he feels a very great deal of anxiety about trying to pursue any kind of acquaintance with her. So he says, quoting Thoreau, "Simplify, simplify. He had made a good beginning when he forbade himself the thought of Della. Once she was banished, he was freed of anticipation and regret, both of which were attended by calculation of a kind, how to have a glimpse of her, which became how to pass her on the street, and then what to say to her, what would make her smile. Or he would fall to thinking how to put something right, how to make something clear. For example, that he avoided her for her sake, and at some cost to himself, emotionally speaking. For a day or two, he would take pleasure in the thought that her good life was unthreatened by his jackness, jackitude, jackicity. How was it possible to be encumbered with slyness, so that his blundering always ended as shrewd harm? It was a shock to his metaphysics to discover that when he had forsworn malicious intent, the effects of his actions, his mere presence, were changed very little and not reliably for the better. What if Della read Patterson and was offended by it? He hadn't been to the library since he went there to draw that picture chicken shack with angels. He had been, as the fellow said, ashamed to show his face, though he knew that a most respectable man in Missouri could be mugged if he happened to turn down the wrong alley. It was ridiculous to have believed that the circumstances of his life would not have touched him essentially so long as they left no visible scars. As if he could just walk into the old house and take the place at the dinner table. He usually banished that thought once or twice a day, but now he gave it up for good. It was gone now, and all the sorrow he would surely have brought with him, like the wind he brought in at night when the house was warm and asleep. It was like a black cloak that swept around him, setting off disturbances among the crystals on the lampshades, leaving books left open, losing places in them, scattering letters half written or half read. He couldn't say he hadn't done any of these things. If they asked him why he had done them, he could not say, I am at the center of a certain turbulence. That would sound flippant at best, a little deranged if they took him seriously. He was inclined to believe that there were A, energy, and B, displacement. Any gesture was, whatever else, like freeing something from your hand, some living thing that would touch or settle wherever it happened to be carried on the surge of displacement. Rattle or fracture confirmed this. So as a living creature, he was ill-suited to the brittle, frangible world of things. It was as though planet energy and planet order had collided and merged, leaving displacement as the settling of the ruins. By extension, he thought, though he knew it was only analogy, the small gesture of, say, recommending a book of poetry to someone became displacement that struck where it would, as it would, converting itself in midair into malice or stupidity. How did people live? His oldest question.
Hello, and thank you so much for reading from this wonderful book, which I have been so privileged to read. Can you hear me all right for these questions? Okay. So Home is actually my favorite book of all time. And so it was a great gift for me to discover that there was going to be another Gilead book about Jack Boughton. At what point did you know that there would be a book about Jack and Della, and how did the book take shape over time?
For a long time, I didn't expect to write a book just about Jack. I think I've said that, I think I'm on the record saying, no, I was not going to do that. But he just continued to live in my mind, and it seemed to me at first that there were practical problems, that I couldn't do it without trenching on his particular part of the world, But then over time, however that happens, the problem sort of resolved itself in my mind. I began to feel that I knew his voice, which is always the crucial thing. And once that was true, then I knew the book would be possible, would be viable.
Thank you. So I want to ask about the scene in the graveyard, which is not how the book starts exactly from the very beginning, but it is, it sort of begins the book, and it's approximately 1/3 of the book. And there's a lot of where Jack and Della really begin to fall in love. It's quite a long part of the book. I wanted to ask how dangerous you wanted their relationship to seem from the start, given that they are, for the most part, in that particular part of the book, alone together.
Well, Jack mentions his anxiety about whether solicitation is an issue, and so on, from their simply being seen together, and, in rather an odd place, as a matter of fact. But there, the segregation was so profound, really, that you can't assume that they would simply take up as if it was normal for them to be talking about their homes and their thoughts and their, all that. So I wanted to give them a place where they could be long-term, and what they're doing is getting through a night, talking the time away. So, a lot of the sort of perhaps social anxiety or whatever else that would otherwise have attended their meeting just sort of wears itself away over, as a consequence of their situation.
Yes, I thought it was actually quite romantic in some ways. I mean, they worry about the guard and what would happen if someone were to come upon them. But it was very, graveyards can be romantic in their way.
Absolutely.
And so to go back a little bit about the book and the Gilead books in general, it seems possible to read this book without having read any of the other ones. But I found that my understanding of Jack was complicated by your other depictions of him, particularly by Gilead and Home. And wonderfully, the books don't feel like they have to go in any prescribed order in order to make sense. And so given the books that exist now, do you prefer for them to be read in any particular way? Or do people come to you and say, I really think, I think they should be read in this way, or I always tell people they should be read in this or that way. Do people have opinions, and do you have thoughts about this?
Sometimes people tell me that they think they should be read in a certain order. But I'm very happy to think they don't need to be read in a certain order. I wanted them all to be about the same world, but not to be dependent on each other like sequels are, So, I mean, it means that things have turned out more or less the way I hoped, if it does seem to be true that you can read any of them in any order.
And so you mentioned this a bit in the section that you read. Jack is a person who's quite preoccupied with the idea of his own nefariousness, as well as the idea of perdition. And so I was interested, or how interested are you in the narrative of goodness for the love of a good woman? And how is that complicated by the illegality of Jack and Della's relationship?
Well, something that's crucial to the whole thing is that Jack really has not taken on all the markings and assumptions and so on of the culture that he is a product of, that he lives within. He doesn't. I've sort of forgotten your question, embarrassingly enough.
No, it was Jack. Sorry. It was a question about Jack and his sense of his own nefariousness. I think he's very concerned about that. And I wanted to ask about that kind of narrative of, goodness for the sake of a good woman and for the love of a good woman, and their relationship as being illegal and those things fitting together.
She's content with him. I mean, people talk about his being reformed by her. He's, I think, certainly encouraged to, keep himself alive and so on by her. But she sees him differently, exactly in this, in a very comparable way to the way he sees her differently, outside the kinds of norms that the society wants to impose on these sorts of relationships. I think I have seen 1,000 times in my life that social life, or life in the economy, can be harder for people the more intelligent they are, and I think that Jack's continuous, landing in odd places and acting inappropriately and so on is simply because he sees the way that people behave as being a great riddle mystery, and he's always trying to understand it in a way, make sense of it, or at least internalize it. And you know, as a consequence of that, people see him as a failure. He sees himself as a failure, but I don't want to understand him in that way. I see him as testing things, and that's nefariousness, you know?
Yes, and you did start to mention that he doesn't necessarily. I think you were starting to say something about how he doesn't necessarily. He kind of pushes against what society believes about. I think you were going to say something about interracial relationships, but maybe you weren't.
Well, I mean, the whole thing that they struggle with, the fact that they can't sit down on a park bench and talk to each other, is a social construction around race, And I think we've gotten a little distance from certain aspects of it, that we can see how completely strange and arbitrary it was, and that people whose sense of reality is different than simply what structures society presents to them, would have struggled with that, would have felt the constraints and, the denial of, Jack is a lonely man, and he, here's this woman he can talk to about poetry and religion and family and all the rest of it. But this line is drawn between them that they're not supposed to cross,
I really loved the romance that you created between them, and how romances are often so full of their own private languages. And there is that private language between Jack and Della with the poems and the drawings. Could you talk a little bit about how you created their communications?
Well, they find each other interesting, the fact that Della has objections to the structure of, Hamlet, you know what I mean? These kinds of things that perhaps would not come up outside a classroom or anything like that. But they sort of unfold themselves, not in the sense of, I've never gotten along with my mother or something, but in the sense of, this is what I find beautiful and this is what I can do. This is the work of my hands, so that they know each other in the richness of their individuality, the pleasures that surround their existence, for themselves, and also as others perceive them, if they can look carefully and closely.
Thanks. And to go back to something you had mentioned before when you were talking about how Jack sees things in a different way than many others in society, there are these characters in the book who are these who kind of play the roles of these others in society, who seem to give Jack leeway in some ways and then take it away. I'm thinking of like the incident with the cat. There are just some people who seem to be generous in some ways, and then, well, maybe not. What were your thoughts as you created these characters and their attitudes? And do you have any thoughts about these kinds of people, or people who might have these sorts of attitudes today?
Well, that phrase, unstable as water, which I actually borrow, is actually from the Bible, and it describes a human being. I think we are highly variable people. We have a great deal of trouble finding our way to something that we can invest ourselves in constantly, including, of course, generosity of spirit and, true insight of whatever kind, true concessions to the rights of other people. There are just thousands of years of demonstration of the fact that people are not very good at that. That there is a certain gentleness, really, in the way that, for example, the desk clerk treats him, because he doesn't finally cheat him. He doesn't finally, call the cops, as he's always saying. but you know, he toys with him because he's playing back and forth across the knife edge of what is possible. You know, he can protect him, or he can embarrass him or insult him.
So in terms of Della's father, and we don't actually get to meet Della's father for a while, and I don't want to give too much away about that, but he's a distinguished bishop, and he disapproves of Jack for a number of reasons, but one of them is being that he believes in separatism for African Americans. Could you talk about your inclusion of his political beliefs in the novel?
Well, you know, I think that there's a tendency where racial relationships are described to act as if all the strength and all the stature is always on one side, you know. There were always, I don't know if separatist is the right word, you know, I mean, there were lots of varieties in this form of thinking, but there was certainly a strong sense that things had to change and that Black people had to have the overwhelming say in how they changed, because they were the people for whom the change was necessary, you know. He wants his family and his community to be thinking together in these terms, you know, and to have this very disruptive white man wander in is simply, you know, not part of his vision, you know. And to have his gifted daughter lured away, in effect, that's not part of the vision either, you know. But in any case, he goes on with, you know, the problem that he's attempting to address, and is ready to accept her back if she comes back, and her child, and so on.
There's a lot about fathers and children in these books, I find. To ask about something a little bit different, you were famously interviewed by President Obama, who cited you as one of his favorite writers. Did it mean something to you in particular to have a novel come out during the Trump administration? And do you feel that fiction has a particular role to play during this time?
I think fiction always has a particular role to play, you know. It has some special privilege, I think, relative to how people think. I don't, of course, I started the novel, I guess I started the novel during the Trump era, but you know, frankly, I have bicameralized my brain with particular rigor where where that gentleman is concerned. But you know, I mean, there are certain humane values that I think people in this culture have very often been loyal to, very often recognized. I think that in this period, they have gone into eclipse farther than I would have believed they could, really. I'm very happy to be identified, of course, with Barack Obama, and also with, you know, humane values, frankly. No cheap shots, you know. It's I mean, I have nothing to regret in terms of the novel. I think that I had my say, and in that particular, in any case, we just have to stop. This ugliness that has been encouraged is terminal. Well, not terminal, perhaps that's not the word, but we have to pass beyond it because it's very destructive.
I think a lot of us are finding ourselves at home if we are not essential workers or going out and working outside of the house. And so many of us are reading a lot right now. And I was wondering if you could recommend maybe 3 books for everyone to read. If everybody had 3 books that we could all read, what would your recommendations be?
You know, my reading habits are very eccentric. People always ask me these questions, and I'm always embarrassed because, you know, what am I reading? I'm reading Dante, you know, and the reason
Well, that's fine.
yeah, but I was invited to give a lecture because it's the 700th anniversary of his death, so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so I thought, well, this would be wonderful because this is an area of literature about which I know very little, you know, and you know, there you are back in the very, you know, earliest period of Western civilization. People just cherishing these poems and so on that are coming out of Italy, and it's heartening. It reminds you of what people do and what people are, that sort of thing, you know. So I have sort of been taking refuge there, and then I have been doing something very strange. All my friends are laughing at me behind their hands. Become fascinated with that old movie, the Birdman of Alcatraz. I
Ah.
think it's making a very profound statement about
Mm-hmm.
society, you know, and that's entirely relevant now. So I have even managed to get the Birdman of Alcatraz, which I am reading with some interest. So, you know, I mean, not everyone follows my notions of
Well,
telling.
I don't know. I'm watching the 8.5 hour national live production of Angels in America.
Oh,
And I'm reading along the Tony Kushner plays. So that's my obsession right now. So,
an obsession is a wonderful thing.
yes.
You can put all sorts of things aside, you know.
Okay, so that was two things. Is there perhaps a third that you would tack on there?
What would be my third? Well, you know, I'm reading Cavalcanti and Petrarch and all these Dante-related people. You know, when I do something, I do it very full scale. You know, so
There's like a web
there's a
that kind of
huge web.
goes.
So I have
Yeah.
the Art of Courtly Love and the commentaries on the Dream of Scipio, and
Mhm.
I mean, you know, it's fun. I love, you know, it's so interesting.
But I was so curious, when you do this, are you taking like lots of notes and things, or do you just kind of let it go into your mind and compost and such, or how does yeah.
That's what I've done. I think I might be less good at it. Maybe my memory is not quite what it could be anymore. But I find that if I just fill my mind with related information,
Mhm.
that kind of that crystallization or a constellation or something will take place, and I will begin to see the importance of things in relation to other things and so on, which is a very great pleasure.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. Thank you. I'm so glad I asked that. That wasn't on my list of questions, but I was like, I'm going to ask this question. So I'm very glad I did.
I'm
Thank you.
glad you did too.
Okay, so something not film or book related. What has been sustaining you during the pandemic? It could be, I don't know, a kind of soup, or, I don't know, some music, anything sustaining.
Well, you know, I'm sustained by the things that have always sustained me, but more so, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, friends, family, religion, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, whether I actually think I have something that I have to do now, which is related to this film that I was talking about and the issues that it raises. And when I feel as though, on the basis of what I know, what I have learned, I have an errand, you know, I have a task that focuses my experience of myself actually in a way that's very valuable to me.
Do you find that you're keeping in touch with people in a different way than you were before the pandemic? Or like I'm handwriting letters a lot more now than I used to. But is it about the same for you than it was before?
I just wrote a letter by hand, as a matter of fact, you know. I There are people that I keep in touch with much more closely than I would have, because I assumed them, you know. Now I know that everyone is not to be taken for granted, you know, just because he or she was fit and happy the last time I heard from him.
But those, I mean, those are really the essentials of life, I think.
Yes.
All right. Oh, well, here I am in the audience questions, and I technically have 10 minutes left. But I think no one will yell at me if I enter the audience questions. Is Stephanie going to yell at me if I go to the audience questions? Okay,
Feel
well,
free.
she didn't pop up and yell at me, so I'm just gonna enter. Okay, this is a craft question of sorts. Can you, within the confines of this forum, give some insight as to how you conceive and lay out plans for the overall combined work of these novels? I feel like that's a very big question. Maybe just one novel, but
Well, you
yeah.
don't. The fact is that they fit together because, I mean, I didn't intend them to. When I wrote Gilead, I did not assume there would be other novels that followed. And so with all the other novels until I got to Jack, you know. And I didn't assume him either until I had sorted out how I could give him a presence. But I don't plot things out. I truly don't. There are ways in which a lot of my choices are governed by the fact that I wrote books that are related to one another, you know. But beyond that, and I even slight that to a certain extent. I take Jack to be a very dishonest fellow, and so he's sort of, I mean, dishonest in the most positive sense. And so what he tells Ames, for example, is not always what he tells the reader in his own book and so on. But I feel as though I create certain opportunities for myself, but, you know, and then I live out the opportunity. I try to figure out what form it should take and what can be made of it and so on, always with reference to what I've written up to that point.
Yes, it's so fun to go back to the books that were chronologically written earlier, and then to kind of find the little opportunities that later came to fruition. Okay, well, this is an interesting question about religion. You're well known for grappling with religious questions in your writing and draw profoundly and fruitfully from the Protestant tradition, including defending the Puritan tradition. The result is poetic and deeply human, and yet many people, including I suspect many of your readers, associate Protestantism and certainly Puritanism with restriction, repression, and joylessness. Could you address the challenges and rewards that have arisen from this dynamic, or indeed, if it's a fair assessment?
Well, it isn't. I mean, if you look historically at, you know, who was being burned at the stake, who was burning others at the stake, you know, the Protestant tradition, they all have their failures, but it is not marked specifically or particularly or fairly, I would say, with repressiveness. There's this sort of strange branch that has sprung up that is very harsh, but that's a departure. They're not reading the old books or anything, you know. And it's Southern, which is not characteristic of, but I won't get into that. In any case, any religious tradition virtually, and certainly anyone in the West that is looked at closely, has a history of repressiveness. And it's simply polemical to single out one and say it is the repressive religion. I admire a lot of the writing that was done then by people whose names are not even known now, not even by people who imagine that they are deeply in the tradition, you know. it's a great loss because a lot of it is very, very generous, great-hearted, beautiful. I have a rescue thing. I'm like certain kinds of dogs, where they simply have to carry the child out of the water, The child in my case is John Calvin or Jonathan Edwards or Moses, or you know what I mean? I find find reputations that seem to me to have been attacked and dismissed destructively and unfairly. The culture would be much richer if it simply retrieved things that it had discarded for no reason. And also I have this very strange, I don't know how to describe it, but I believe in the continued existence of the dead in a sense, in a special sense, that if they deserve justice, they are still owed justice. This does not end with the mere fact of their having been dust for a century or two,
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I was awfully candid there, wasn't I?
No, I that was perfect. Thank you so much. Oh, here's a question about housekeeping. Do you think the characters of housekeeping need another story, in as much as I find myself thinking about them and wondering what the next part of their lives look like?
That's an interesting question. When housekeeping being the first thing I even finished, let alone published, I wanted to write something, and I was sort of trying to see what was going on among my contemporaries, by reading the New York Times book review section and so on. And I never found anything that I could relate to. There was nothing that seemed, I had no voice for in these rooms, So it occurred to me that my own little home country, the mountains of Idaho, they were virtually untouched by literature. I had them to myself. And so I could write that world out of my materials, I hadn't lived there for 20 years at the time I wrote it. But then when it happened and it worked and I was pleased with it, I had this terrible fear of using the same solution again, like it would become a gimmick, a signature thing in an unpleasant sense. So I did nonfiction and just studying things, 23 years of it, which I do not regret 1 minute of. It was wonderful. But then finally, I began thinking fictionally again. I don't know why. I began thinking fictionally because suddenly there was a voice in my head that was John Ames. But after I had written Housekeeping, I missed and mourned my characters, which is always true. But because I had this fear of repeating a solution, I didn't let them, they drowned in oblivion. I did not let them have another life. Then when I wrote Gilead, I had the same experience afterward of this sort of loneliness and mourning, and I thought, why do this? If the characters are still alive for me, give them a life, it's all these years have passed. I don't think I could or should go back to housekeeping, but I feel a little bit as though I truncated that fiction arbitrarily.
So maybe back in that time, it may have extended, but now it is its own thing.
Right,
And,
exactly.
Yeah. I have a question, which is, do you feel, I've read your nonfiction and your fiction, and do you feel that your brain works in a significantly different way when you're writing fiction and nonfiction? And if so, how? And is there a very distinct way in which you write nonfiction versus how you write fiction? I mean, I imagine there must be, but for me, I have a very specific method of writing nonfiction with like index cards and like this whole thing, and fiction is very, very different. So I was curious about that for you.
Well, you know, it feels very different to write nonfiction than to write fiction. And I write nonfiction on a laptop and fiction by hand in general. True. When I'm writing nonfiction, what I generally do is I read a lot of books on the subject of whatever it is. And then I abuse them horribly, like all sorts of marginal notes and scrawls and underlining and so on. And then when I begin writing, I count on myself to remember the web of relationships among these things that I have scattered around in my house, you know. I could never do index cards. I can't write on yellow pads. I need a ballpoint pen and a spiral notebook, or I'm just helpless.
I mean, I know of your genius, obviously, but I'm just blown away that you can just keep that all in your mind. That is, wow, I am blown away. Okay. Anyway, thank you. That was very exciting to hear about. I have many more questions about nonfiction versus fiction, but I will move on to other people's questions. What role does empathy play in your novels? Do you intentionally think about empathy, or is it an unconscious consequence of your subject matter?
Well, I don't think I think about it in the abstract particularly. I think of empathy as basically, you know, humane conduct, humane perception, relative to which other perception is incomplete. Other conduct is perhaps regrettable in one way or another, you know, of course it always is. But I think that people, any human being is really a profound phenomenon and mystery and uniqueness, you know. And I couldn't believe in characters that I did not believe those things about. I can't, you know, I can't write stick figures, you know. It's just a matter, to me, it's just a matter of truthfulness, you know.
Thank you. Your love of poetry, in particular Emily Dickinson, is well documented. In an article in the New York Times in 2017 on finding the right word, you say, it's like wrestling with the angel. On the one hand, you feel the constraints of what can be said, but on the other hand, you feel the infinite potential. Your prose could often read as poetry in isolation. Do you, or have you ever, apart from your beautiful prose, written poetry? And if so, has it been for yourself or with a view to publication?
Well, you know, I'm very overdetermined in terms of what I do, what I can produce. I'm a terrible poet. I can't write 10 lines without shuddering with self-contempt, you know. And I mean, maybe somebody else would tell me different, but somebody else is never going to see this poetry.
That's what I was going to ask, is has anyone seen it?
In any case, I would do it in a minute if I could. You know, it was my old aspiration when I was a child and so on. There are things, I mean, I write a lot of dialogue in my novels. If I try to write thinking that I'm writing a scene in a play, I can't write dialogue at all. I'm just crowded into my genre no matter what I attempt. Maybe someday I'll write a decent poem, you know. Maybe someday a poem of mine will see the light of day, but I wouldn't bet money on it, frankly.
Well, I like this idea that maybe you have like drawers and drawers of secret poems just stashed away, you know?
I wish I did.
You've written and spoken about William James. Can you say a little bit about when you first started reading him and how his ideas might influence your fiction and essays? Do we have anything to learn from James, or is there a word he might have for us in the time we're in?
Well, I read a certain amount of William James when I was in college, and I was fortunate enough to have a course in American philosophy, a rare thing, I think. But in any case, the thing I think probably the most striking argument that he makes from the point of view of its utility for me is in The Will to Believe, that collection of essays of his. And when he talks about how the fact that you know two things about something or three things, you feel as though you can extrapolate from a very limited, perhaps accidental knowledge of a thing. It's an error about the nature of reality to assume that you can extrapolate from a partial experience. I think that when you watch how the public mind works or how the academic mind works or whatever, you see people seizing on these understandings of reality that they do. We never have sufficient grounds for the kind of certainty that can become so excessive, so dangerous. He has a much more sort of sense of reality as dynamic and active, which I would think is a good description of it.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, here's another question about movies. So you've already mentioned one that you have been rewatching lately. You've mentioned in the New Yorker's recent profile that you sometimes rewatch movies you like several times. What are some of your favorite films, and how do you think about cinema?
Well, I think cinema is certainly one of the great modern arts. I think that it occupies a strange position of being popular or being very rarefied sort of art house. And I think that it experiences a certain unease and compromise around the fact of being a popular art form, which I think makes it in many cases less valuable than it would be if it just trusted the public and did what it could. I watch movies like The Verdict, the Paul Newman film about the lawyer. I watch. It's not like I watch these things compulsively. This is a kind of COVID phenomenon. It is true, though, that if I'm struck by a film, like, for example, for a while it was Spartacus, because I was so interested in the assumption that if order fell away, people would behave well, rather, you know what I mean? It's not Mad Max. It's people, dancing or having babies and all the rest of it, It's an optimistic view of humanity that I see in earlier forms and don't see now. But anyway, I'm always trying to put things into place as part of a historical sequence. But it's also true that films are so complex if they're well made that until I've seen them 4 or 5 times, I wouldn't say I've seen them at all. They're just, when you see all the problems of narrative that people have when they're compressed in such a brief period of time, it's amazing.
Do you ever purchase the screenplays and look at screenplays, or are you interested in cinematography or any of that? It's the narrative and the way that movies tell a story for you.
Well, yes, but American movies I'm interested in because very often, depending on the period, they can, like this film that I have studied lately, it's about the problems of penal reform. It's about, it's about how to be humane to people who are vulnerable and so on. And of course, that was, Nixon's enemy list and all the rest of it. Now it seems to me as if instead of the interest being something that engages you about a human social reality, it tends to be crash, bang, things exploding everywhere and so on. As if there could be no excitement except this sort of visceral response to carnage, and I don't think that says anything very good about the current state of the popular mind or how the popular mind is understood by people who address it.
Okay. You are consistent in your condemnation of cynicism. How do we think about cynicism in a time like this when it's so easy to reduce others to their politics? How do we avoid dehumanization while being angry and calling for justice?
We're in a very tricky situation. There is no question about that. I think that, surely there can't finally be any argument about the fact that the country exists to create lives that people would call thriving and flourishing, and this does not, mean wealth or prominence or anything like that. It can just be the satisfactions of living well, living a good life, and I think that's what people typically want, what they typically dream of. Cynicism is a categorical judgment about things that you do not know anything about, typically, that you have no basis for. It tends to, browse over the landscape and find what it can that is bitter and disheartening and ugly, in contempt of the fact that many things are beautiful and humane and endearing, Cynicism is the end of effort. If you can be dismissive, then your work is done, as far as at least your own self-presentation is concerned. There's nothing, we can't afford cynicism now. It's capitulation. But you also can't afford it as a matter of sort of individual integrity, because it means that you will not bother to look farther, that you write everything off in the same stroke.
I was struck by a phrase that you used in your answer to the last question. How would you define a good life?
Well, that's that's the old struggle of humankind on Earth, has been establishing a good life individually or collectively. But I think that most of us think a good life would be living in circumstances that were conducive to health, having a life of sufficient stability so that your energies do not go all into anxiety and perhaps compromise, and compromise in the the unpleasant sense, where you do less well, think less clearly, pay less attention than you would otherwise, because you feel as though you're under some sort of pressure. It means, for most people, it means reproducing, carrying on the life of the species. Something I frankly have found very interesting. But, for us, we're, as creatures, to be in a reasonable state of health and a reasonable state of mind, and then able to do what human beings do, which is make things, learn things, create things. What more,
And yet that that does seem like quite a lot of demands, doesn't it, sometimes? Or, you know, or it feels like asking a lot sometimes, I feel. Let's see, I think the remaining questions. Okay, so this might be the last question. So we'll end on a question about Jack. How did the parable of the prodigal son influence your understanding of Jack's narrative?
Well, that's such a strong parable, such a multifaceted parable. But I've always sort of been struck by the fact that this prodigal comes home, and then he is home, and he's not the most admirable person in the world. He does not ask for his father's forgiveness or anything. His father forgives him before any words are exchanged. He's taken his father's wealth. His father obviously has a great deal more, but he's thrown it away. And there's no suggestion that he feels any compunction about that. He just simply got hungry after a certain point. So there's no sense of any sort of moral rising in this prodigal. I think that it was, given that is the character that we are given in the parable, you think, how does it feel to his father a week later? What, and I think that's a real question, because I think that a person can say, your brother was dead and now he's alive, and it has that absolute meaning because you have lost a child. And then there can be, at the same time, the feeling, why doesn't he feel any regret about what he's done? Why doesn't he love the family more than, too much to do what he has done, and so on. That's just toying in my mind, but nevertheless, it seems to me that the narrative of the prodigal son is the beginning of a story that I can't help sort of unwinding in my own mind.
Well, Stephanie?
Here I am. Thank you both so much for the interesting conversation and for spending your evening with us here on Zoom, like we all seem to do so many times.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Marilyn, thank you for bringing us another novel. As I mentioned before, having a new book from you in this very trying year was a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. Very kind.
Okay. Good night to everybody, and see you again sometime.
Great. Good night.
Be well.
Yes, you too.